Okay, Jimmy Akin, thank you so much for sitting down with me today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, this is actually really quite an honor for me. You were fairly, I would say, instrumental, at least initially, in my conversion experience.
Hmm.
One of the books that had been lent to me early on when I was exploring, I'd already converted to Christianity insofar as I understood what that meant, but then I ran into this difficulty with church affiliation as I was
Hmm.
attending different churches and trying to form myself in the faith and understand what it meant. And someone gave me a copy of one of Patrick Madrid's editions of, I think they were called Surprised by Truth. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And so they were a compilation of conversion stories, and he had published several volumes of those from what I understand. But the one that I had included your conversion story, which
Hmm.
I don't remember a lot of the details now because this is some 20 years ago, but I do remember yours standing out significantly for me and being fairly instrumental in convincing me of certain hangups that I had.
Hmm.
But I thought it would be great if you could refresh those of us who are familiar with the conversion story, and for those of us who don't know your conversion story, tell us a little bit about how you entered into the Catholic Church eventually.
Okay, so I grew up in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which is where I live today, and my parents initially took our family to a Church of Christ. They were from Texas. Which is where I was born, and they belonged to the Church of Christ, which is a conservative fundamentalist denomination in the United States, and it's
Okay.
particularly common in this part of the country. When I was about 7 years old, though, they had some kind of a disagreement with the elders of the church, and they stopped going. And so after
Mm,
that, I was raised nominally Protestant. When I was 20 years old, I encountered the work of a crazy televangelist named Gene Scott.
mm,
But it was enough that he got my attention and made me sit still long enough to really listen to a presentation of the Christian message, and I ended up becoming a Christian,
okay.
consciously, explicitly.
Yeah.
And I wanted to devote my life to God's word, and so I started studying the Christian faith, and including the Bible. You know, I read the whole thing,
Hmm.
or what I thought was the whole thing, and
Mm,
I began studying the beliefs of all different groups of Christians because I recognize now here in Fayetteville we have about a bazillion churches, and they're very different from each other. And I recognize that what church is within convenient driving distance, or has music I like, or has a youth group I like, because I was young then, or
mhm.
has a preacher I like, none of those are good tests of theological truth. And it was
Mm.
truth I was interested in. So I read Methodists, I read Catholics, I read Calvinists, I read Baptists, I read Pentecostals, I read everybody, Eastern Orthodox, everybody,
Would you
to
say
get
mostly
a.
contemporary sources at that point, or were you kind of jumping into the history?
It was some of both.
Okay.
In addition to reading contemporary theologians, and of course, virtually all Protestants are contemporary
Sure,
by
sure,
historic
sure. Yeah, yeah.
standards.
Relatively speaking, yeah.
Yeah, but I would also read the church fathers. And in particular, there was an edition edited by Maxwell Staniforth from Penguin called Early Christian Writings that was basically the Apostolic Fathers. And
Mm,
reading them kind of opened my eyes beyond the Protestant world because I recognized these guys did not sound like contemporary Protestants. And so
mm,
that was a notable discovery for me. I also, being in my 20s, I got married at this point, and I got married to a woman who was a former Catholic. Now she was no longer identifying as Catholic, at least when I married her.
mhm.
But then after we got married, Renee was her name. She went back to the Catholic Church, which had the effect of wrecking my career because I had planned on becoming a Protestant seminary professor, possibly a pastor.
Mm,
And that's very difficult to do in a conservative Protestant environment when you have a spouse who's Catholic.
mhm.
So I went back to decided to go back to school and uh, became a grad student in philosophy and figured I'd take the philosophy route if I couldn't do the religious route.
For like
I
an academic career,
as a
basically.
career, yeah.
Yeah.
And then one day I was reading a book from a Catholic point of view, and the author quoted had an extended quotation of Matthew 16, which is the "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church"
Mhm.
passage. And I'd always said, as based on what I had been taught as a Protestant, that Peter is not the rock. That the rock is something else, and that Jesus
Mhm.
is contrasting Peter with the rock. Specifically, I I believed that the rock was the revelation that Jesus is the Christ. And so,
Mhm.
what Jesus is doing in this passage is contrasting Peter with that. It's like, you're this little stone, Peter, but on this great big rock of the revelation of who I am, that's
Okay.
what I'm going to build my church on. But
Mhm.
as I was reading this passage this day, I'd been arguing to try to get my wife out of Catholicism. But
Hmm.
as I was reading this passage this day, I noticed that there were structural features in the text that you don't even have to go to the Greek to see. They're right there. They're so clear. They're even in the English translation, and they demand that Peter be the rock. And I recently did an episode of the Jimmy Akin podcast explaining them, and I have a table where I show you how the structural features work and so forth. But I
Mhm.
realized in a flash Peter has to be the rock, and I have to change my view on this. So I did. And I said, well, if Catholics are right that Peter's the rock, then that means that when Jesus goes back to heaven, Peter's going to be in charge because Jesus said he's going to build his church on him.
Yeah.
And being in charge of the earthly church means that you can be described as a pope. So I concluded Catholics could fairly say that Peter was the first pope. Now, whether there were meant to be any later popes was a separate
Yeah.
question.
Sure.
So at this point, I was in grad school, and I basically spent a year coasting through my classes. I mean, I got A's in all of them, but I was coasting. And what I was really doing was spending all of my time studying Catholic theology, because I realized if Catholics are right about Peter being the first pope, they could be right
Mhm.
about other things. And I need to do a review of all of the categories of systematic theology with an open mind. So
What particular strand of theology at this point would you have described, like what, or even denomination would you have been most aligned with at that point?
at this point in time, I was going to a conservative Presbyterian church.
Okay.
Um, that doesn't mean I was limited strictly to Presbyterian thought. I was a 5 point Calvinist, but
Okay.
I also recognized openness on other questions, like,
Okay.
could God still give private revelation today?
Hmm.
Could the charismatic gifts still be functioning? That's something I would describe myself as open on.
Okay.
And so anyway, I spent a year reviewing the categories of systematic theology, and I ended up concluding that the Catholic understanding of things is better biblically grounded
Hmm.
than the various Protestant understandings. And so I decided, well, I need to become a Catholic. And I hid this
Hmm.
from my wife for a long time because I didn't want her getting her hopes up if I and
Okay.
in case I discovered some fatal flaw
Hmm.
and didn't become Catholic. So I hid it from her for a long time. But then once I realized, no, I've got to become Catholic, I let her know, and then she got sick,
Hmm.
and she ended up dying within just over 2 months. It turns
Wow.
out she had an aggressive form of colon cancer
Okay.
that her doctor thinks she only had for a few months. It was so aggressive.
Hmm.
And so I was actually received into the Catholic Church in her hospital room using the
Wow.
emergency shortened form of the rites.
Okay.
And and she passed on, which of course was devastating. And
Hmm.
I've been Catholic ever since.
Mm. I mean, that's an insane amount of fluctuation in your life at a fairly pivotal age, right? I mean, when we're getting our our post-secondary education, there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot of
Mhm.
directions that are open to us, and so how did you find stability after that? I mean, obviously, you'd like to think that the church provided a lot of that for you, but how did you maintain your faith and rediscover, if you needed to, your peace amongst all of that sort of turmoil?
Well, I guess in my case, so this all happened when I was 28.
Okay.
And one of the things when Renee passed on, one of the things that opened up was the possibility of moving elsewhere for a job, because
Okay.
Renee was very rooted here in Northwest Arkansas and would not have
Mm,
moved.
okay.
But in the process of investigating the Catholic faith, I'd learned about this organization in California called Catholic Answers.
Mm,
And I ended up, after she passed on, I ended up contacting them about the possibility of working for them as an apologist. So I went out to
mm,
California, I auditioned for the job, and I've been working for them ever since.
mm,
Now, that did not provide a bunch of initial stability in my life, because
okay.
in addition to having to try to complete grad school, which ended up not happening, I also moved out to California. I was starting this new job in a new field, and I'm in a different part of the country with no social safety net or anything like that.
Mm,
So it continued to be a rather disrupted part of my life. I also was grieving my wife,
yeah.
and I remember there being days where I would get home and I would feel such a relief to be able to be alone and not be around
Mm,
people while I was grieving.
mm,
And but eventually, time heals. Unfortunately, within another 4 years after my wife died, my mom, the other significant woman in my life, died very unexpectedly. She was
mm,
only 56. Based on the lifespans of the women in her family, she should have lived to her late 90s. So this was
okay.
40 years earlier than it should have
Yeah.
happened.
Mm,
And that kind of put me back on the emotional recovery cycle
mhm,
of grieving my
mhm,
mom now. It's like both of the important women in my life are no longer here,
mhm,
and it was another huge blow. But time heals, and I trusted God. You asked about like how I kept my faith and things like that.
mhm,
Actually, my
mhm,
faith was strong at this
mm,
point. When Renee was dying, I mean, it was very sad and very emotionally traumatic. One of the
mhm,
things I noticed in the immediate aftermath of her passing was that multiple people who knew me and her reported after death communications, or ADCs. They didn't have
mm,
that term, but that's what they're called.
okay.
Reported after death communications with Renee.
Okay.
And I didn't have one. At least I didn't have one I identified. I actually think now I may have had one.
Mm,
But after death communications are astonishingly common. A minimum of 40 to 50% of the population reports at least one ADC during the course of their lifetime.
mm,
It's probably higher than that, but that's a minimum. So basically,
okay.
a minimum of half the population reports having at least one ADC. And I think I did have one with Renee. I just didn't recognize it at the time. At least I think that's a likelihood. But what I
Okay.
said to myself was, I noticed that the people who were reporting ADCs of Renee were people whose faith was not as strong. And
Mm,
so I interpreted this as, well, maybe this is something God's letting them have because it will
yeah.
help them more.
Right.
Whereas with a stronger faith, I don't need it as much. And so that may be why I don't have one.
Mm,
And so my faith was not in question in this period.
okay.
And so I didn't really have to work to maintain faith. I just went about living the Christian life as a Catholic.
Mm. Do you think that if you didn't have access to this new sacramental grace, that it would have been more of a challenge? Like, do you wonder where your faith would have ended up if you hadn't converted into the Catholic Church?
No,
You d
I haven't really, I death is for, I mean, it's going to vary for different people,
Mhm,
but the fact that someone dies, if you have a solid Christian faith, does
mm,
not challenge your faith.
Mm.
because I mean it's suffering and when
Mhm.
someone dies,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
that doesn't mean suffering doesn't have to challenge your faith. It's something that
Mm.
has to be accepted and endured and prayed about, but it's not something that is automatically a threat to the Christian faith because Jesus told us we
Mm.
were going to suffer in this world. And
Mhm.
Jesus talked about we're going to die, we're going to stand before God. So none of this is a surprise from a
Mm.
Christian point of view. It may be a surprise for Christians who've never thought about those teachings of the faith,
Yeah.
but the reality of death and the reality of suffering are things the Christian faith acknowledges. And so it doesn't have to come as a surprise or a threat when you encounter it.
Mhm. Don't you think
In,
though
in,
that
in
like
fact, in fact, I would say today people are shielded from these realities in a way Christians in the past were not. Um,
okay.
in the past, even if you in the past, you had large numbers of people die due to infant mortality. You know,
Yeah.
in their first 5 years, you
Mhm.
expected in the past until the 20th century, as a parent, you expected to lose multiple children. So people would say,
Yeah.
"Well, I've had children, but I've raised five."
Mhm.
And similarly, people had plagues, they had wars, they had accidents, they didn't have modern medicine, and the death rate was higher even for adults in the
Mm.
past. We're living in
Mhm.
a very blessed time today where the chance
Mhm.
of dying a violent death or dying prematurely of a medical condition has gone down incredibly. And
Mhm.
that's a great blessing for us today. But it also means that we've been shielded from realities that Christians have had to confront all the way through Christian history, and humans have had to confront all the way through human history. So to us, oh, suddenly someone is dead and I'm suffering, that's more shocking to us today than it
Right.
would be people in the past because we've been shielded from that reality.
Do you think the fact that we've been so shielded from it is why we are so intolerant of pain and suffering, and why we tend to object more, based on, or why we sympathize more with objections like the problem of pain?
I think that there is a significant role that our nature as kind of modern tenderfoots
Mm.
plays in making us more sensitive to suffering and more concerned about the problem of physical evil.
Okay. So you think that we have a specific role to play in terms of how we interpret the faith because of that?
Well, I don't know. It's a matter of interpreting the faith. I think most people have never thought about it. Most people
Okay.
today assume things are going to go well, and then they get
Mm.
surprised when they don't.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge with this is that we all kind of in a general sense acknowledge that yeah, suffering is a part of this life, and we are all going to die. My spouse is going to die, my friends, my parents, my loved ones are all going to die. But not many of us are prepared for they're going to die. My spouse is going to die when we're 28 and we're newlyweds and
Mhm.
we have our whole future ahead of us. So I think that there's this sense that when things like that
It's a shock.
happen,
Hmm.
yeah, like that's more tragic. And why wouldn't God, whom I love, I'm devoted to, I'm following, why wouldn't he be more attentive to preventing something like that happen? I think that's the difficulty that a lot of Christians have when they're trying to reconcile the acute tragedy of those kinds of experiences with their love with God and with, the teachings of the Lord when he says things like, what kind of a father, when their children asks for a piece of bread, would give them a rock or a stone, right? Like, we would think, well, yeah, I'm asking him for just this simple thing that my wife is healed, or that my loved ones or myself, like I don't have to go through premature suffering or premature death or something like that.
Yeah, this is. I understand and I sympathize with people who reason in this way.
Mm,
Um, it's also a limited perspective, and it's a
okay.
perspective that is shaped by. I mean, I'll give you an example.
Mm,
I'm sure you've seen the Lord of the Rings movies by Peter
hmm.
Jackson, right?
Yeah.
Well, in the first movie, there is a scene where Gandalf is talking with Frodo,
Yeah.
and they're in the mines of Moria or at the entrance to the mines of
Yep.
Moria. They've just come in. And
Hmm.
Gandalf explains to Frodo, nobody is guaranteed a time.
Mm.
Death is a reality that can come when you don't expect it. My own life history illustrated that to me. And so that line, and not just Renee's death, but after I moved to California, I
Yeah.
was living in an apartment on the third floor of a building, and there was this pair of pigeons that decided to nest on my balcony. And I watched that pair of pigeons try to raise multiple clutches of offspring. They kept laying
Mm.
eggs, and they never had a match.
Mm.
And it was sad. But I recognized here with these pigeons too, no one is guaranteed a time.
Mm.
And the perspective that you're describing is one in which people think they have a guaranteed time. It's like,
That
okay,
it's owed
God,
to us.
I know my spouse will die 60 years from now, but why are they dying now?
Right.
Well, that's not the way the world works.
Mm.
And sometimes people do die prematurely. And that's
Hmm.
in terms of why God allows that. I mean, we can talk about the problem of evil if you want. The
Mm.
short answer is God would not tolerate any evil, moral or physical, unless he was going to bring about a greater good. Now,
Mm.
we can see the principle implicit there because we use it all the time. I mean, if you have kids, you need to get your kids vaccinated for certain diseases.
Mm.
And the reason for that is the vaccination will spare the child much worse suffering and possible death later in life if the child is vaccinated, at least for certain diseases. People may
Yeah.
dispute which vaccines should have vaccines and which shouldn't, but we can all agree on the principle. Sometimes you need to get a shot,
Yeah.
whether it's a vaccine or a cure
Or
or
just
whatever
medicine
it
in
is.
general,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, but I want to keep it focused on injections
Okay.
because think about it now from the child's perspective. Your parents love you, they take care of you, they are surrogates for God in taking care of
Mm.
you, and yet all of a sudden, whether because you need a vaccine or because you've gotten sick, suddenly your parents take you into this strange place that's cold and smells funny and is full of strangers who are going to
Mm.
stick a needle into your arm.
Hmm.
And it's terrifying for the child. And the shot hurts, and the child
Yeah. Yeah.
screams, and the parents who are supposed to care for you are suddenly betraying you from the
Hmm.
child's perspective. So this is an evil to the
Mm.
child. This is a physical
Hmm.
evil. The child is suffering. But the parents tolerate the suffering because it's going to spare the child even greater suffering later. And
Hmm.
so if we can make that decision for our children, God can make the same decision for us. The
Mm.
difference between us and a small child is we can understand the principle that's at play. So,
Mm.
according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, God would not tolerate any evil unless he was going to bring about a greater good. The question is then, well, what greater good is going to be brought about? And sometimes we may be able to provide reasonable speculations in answer to that.
Sure.
Like in the
Yeah.
case of moral evil, God tolerates moral evil to allow freely chosen love.
Mm.
Because he couldn't, if he eliminated moral evil, then any love that's shown would not be freely chosen. It would quash
Right.
free will.
Right.
With physical evil, it's a little harder, but we can see purposes to physical suffering. I mean, that's why we have nociceptors in our pain nerves in our skin to alert us of danger. So
Mm.
so pain, when it's performing its normal function, is actually helpful to us. It keeps us,
Yeah.
it alerts us to danger and helps us stay out of it.
Yeah.
When pain is abnormally functioning, there's a greater question of why is this allowed? And
Mm.
here we hit a limit on human knowledge. Now, humans have always had limits on their knowledge. Today, we have smaller limits on our knowledge than our ancestors did,
Mm.
due to advances in science and scholarship and data storage and communication and so forth.
Yeah.
But in this life, there's a point where we hit our limit on knowledge. We can't always say, why did God allow this particular suffering? Or why does God allow this class of suffering? But at that point, if you're a person of faith, you can say, well, just like a small child can still trust its parents even after they've taken the
Hmm.
child in to get a shot, I can trust God even though I may not know the specific reason for
Yeah.
this particular suffering.
It is interesting to watch as a parent, your kids go through the phases of, infancy and adolescence and up into teenage years and young adulthood, because the amount of adversity that they're able to endure and their reaction to it does change over time, right? Like the kinds of very sort of simple sufferings and almost superficial sufferings that we would look at and say, well, that just wouldn't interrupt my day at all, for a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old
It's
is
the cause of a
devastating.
meltdown.
It's
Yeah.
exactly like the reaction to that would be the kind of thing that if an adult did that, you would think, oh my goodness, their life is about to, like, this is a crisis, right? But of course, as they age and as they experience different degrees of suffering, those former sufferings seem quite trivial, right? And it makes me wonder that, in the grand scheme, as all of this becomes relative to one another, if we will look back, God willing, we'll be able to look at our lives and say, wow, that was kind of trivial, actually, that thing that I thought was so catastrophic to my life.
And frankly,
and perhaps that perspective and the good that might come from it too, that you were alluding to. Yeah.
And frankly, all death, since life is finite, is trivial in comparison to eternal life,
Yeah.
which is infinite. So
Right,
it does kind of bring a
absolutely.
new perspective. Incidentally, you mentioned how much kids yell and scream and so forth. And there's something interesting there. There's actually a note of hope, in that organisms under God's plan, are designed to fit their lives and what they're going to encounter, because otherwise they'd die and they wouldn't survive. So you can tell something about the creature by looking at its offspring. Now, if you look at baby deer, deer, when they're born, they're up and running within minutes.
Right.
Human babies are not doing that, but baby deer are also and human babies don't do that because they have human parents to care for them in a way adult deer
Right.
can't. Baby deer are also silent because their species survival strategy, they are prey animals. Their species survival strategy is running away from stuff. So when they're born, they need to be able to run, and they need to keep their mouths shut so they don't attract attention from predators. On the other hand, think about baby birds, like the pigeons on my balcony. If they had ever gotten any kids, they would stick their heads up and constantly have been crying for food. Because they can't fly, not at this stage of life. They need their parents to gather and bring them food, and they can safely yell about it because they're up high where predators can't get. And whether it's in a tree or on my balcony, the predators can't get to them. So they can be noisy as infants, and it's not a problem for their survival. On the other hand, human babies are not living in trees or on third-floor balconies. They're down on the ground. And yet, human babies make an abnormal amount of noise compared to other species. They yell their heads off, and they can only survive because their parents are going to protect them. And what that means is, as far as mankind is concerned, we own this rock. We are we're one of the, I can't say only because I haven't checked, but we, unlike other creatures, can have infants who scream their heads off, and we still make sure they survive. And that's a testament to the human race and how much not a threat other creatures are to us, or our offspring would not be able to do this.
They wouldn't be so vulnerable. Yeah. It's one of those, the many things that you could point about human nature that says, we don't quite fit into the natural world in the same way that everything else does. That if we didn't have our reason and the technology that proceeds from our reason, that we would just be incredibly vulnerable and mismatched, especially with respect to our infants.
Well,
with the natural world.
it's not just our technology, because human infants have been screaming since before the development of modern technology. So technology is a help in the domination that God has given us over Earth, but it's
even
not
primitive
essential.
technology, I guess, is what I'm thinking of too,
Yeah,
right?
spears and stuff. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So just the fact that we would organize our lives and our environment in such a way to better fit with our lack of alignment with the natural world, or a lack of fitting with it. It's interesting too, because just the other day, so we've got our youngest son is John, and he's almost 1.5,
Uh-huh.
and he's been one of our most difficult babies. He's very
Oh.
choleric. He's a
Oh.
ginger. He's redheaded. He's got that redheaded
Mhm.
temperament, but he's extremely
That may
cute.
be a fiction, but okay. Mhm.
Well, yeah, yeah, it is, but
Mhm.
it's a fun stereotype to play into a little bit. But
Mhm.
he just the other day, one of our older kids, I think it was Margaret, who's also a redhead.
Mhm.
She's 5 years old, and she said something like, it's a good thing he's cute because otherwise we just wouldn't tolerate him screaming all the time, right? And that's exactly true. It's one of those
We are
those mercies that God bakes into it all.
we are programmed to find certain characteristics cute
Mm,
precisely for this reason.
yeah.
Big heads, big eyes, those are that's why we find human babies cute. It's fine why we find puppies and kittens cute, and it's what
Mm,
makes them tolerable.
right. Right.
Um,
Exactly.
yeah, there's also a relationship, as long as we're on the subject of why we are the way we are.
Mm,
Um, there's also a reason that human babies are born so helpless, which
mm,
is we're going to grow up to be smart. And that means we have ginormous brains
yeah.
compared to other creatures. And that means that we're going to have bigger heads as adults, and that head needs to fit through the birth canal.
Mm,
And for a bipedal creature, which is part of what lets us, it frees up our hands for
hmm
manipulating our environment and thus being able to implement ideas that we have. So we need to be bipeds for that reason, which also
yeah.
contributes to the complex of our greater intelligence compared to other creatures.
Mm,
But being a biped forces our legs and our pelvis into a certain shape that shrinks the birth canal.
mm,
So the head, human babies have to be born when their heads are small enough to be able to not just to fit through the birth canal, but to fit through the birth canal of a biped,
mm,
which is smaller than the birth canal for other creatures that aren't bipeds.
mm,
And that means they have to be born freaky premature compared to other
mm,
creatures, which is
mm,
why human babies are so helpless compared to other creatures, and it's why they stay helpless for so long, because of how immature they are upon birth.
mm,
And that means human parents need to stay together. It takes 2 decades basically to raise a human from birth
mhm.
to maturity, and even then it's kind of questionable maturity. Um, but that means human parents to take care of this prolonged maturation period need to stay together for decades,
Mm,
and that provides monogamy.
yep.
It also provides why human women are sexually receptive when they're not during their infertile periods,
Mm,
because that's one of the things that helps incentivize the male to stay around for
stick
those
around, yeah.
decades.
Sure.
And so you get all kinds of things falling out of the life strategy that God has designed into human beings.
Mhm,
It explains why we're born so helpless. It explains why we have such long developmental periods. It explains why our parents need to stick together. It explains why human women are sexually receptive when they're not fertile. It
mm,
explains all kinds of stuff.
mhm. Yeah, it is interesting, the experience of being a father of many kids and now seeing that whole progression. Our oldest is 16, so we haven't got all
Mhm.
the way up to that full maturation.
Just 4 more
But
years.
yeah, exactly. But there is so much if you're attentive to it and you're contemplating it, there's so much providence that you can observe through
Mhm.
that whole experience. One of the things is that when you have your first, especially, you go from being this young adult who has been typically fairly self-centered in your interests
Mhm.
so far, right? And not only that, but the world is also kind of focused on you in a particular way, so that it's easing you along and it's still helping you in your maturation process. And then all of a sudden you have this life that is very needy and very helpless, like you say, and it's a shock to your system. It's a shock to your temperament, to your ego, to your habits, and all of these things. And to the degree that it's very exhausting. It's obviously physically exhausting, but it's very mentally exhausting as well for those reasons.
Mhm.
And if it weren't for the fact that they were so helpless, from my experience, you tend to just put them down if they seem content, right? And then you get a break, you get some relief. You can watch a show or read a book or connect with your spouse, which becomes more and more difficult in those seasons. But then before long, they start to need something again, and so those moments of reprieve are short lived. But if they weren't short lived, I know, again, because of my own selfish tendencies, I would probably just leave them there for as long as I possibly could. But it seems to me that the point of this vocation of marriage and then parenthood is to become more loving, become more selfless, become more willing to sacrifice the things that you would want and to lay down your life for another. And that doesn't come easily in a voluntary way. It's something that, as often I find through that vocation, forced out of you. It kind of forces you to lay down your life for the other. And the fact that they are so needy and demanding, they don't just express their needs nicely, they demand that their needs be met. It's what forces you to make those kinds of sacrifices. So there's so much mercy in just the untangling of human pride and sort of selfishness in all of that, I find.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you too. So you didn't move on. You didn't get remarried at any point, obviously.
Well, not for lack of trying, but
Okay.
I mean, I started dating again after a few years after Renee died.
You did. Okay.
But by this point I was in my 30s,
Yeah.
and it is hard to find people of the opposite sex who are suitable prospective spouses at that age,
Yep.
especially if you don't want complicated marital histories
Sure.
that can raise doubts about, is this person even free to marry? And also you have jobs at this point that take up, it's not like you're in classes with lots of available people. And so there are many fewer candidates available.
Yep.
Especially if you're not wanting complicated marital histories.
Yeah.
And that was a limit. I did start dating, and then mom died, and that put me back in the grief cycle.
Okay.
And that made me even older by the time I was ready to reemerge from that. So no, I haven't remarried. Would love to. At this point, I'm kind of reconciled. That may not be God's plan for my life, but if there are women out there who are available and don't have complicated marital histories and are willing to put up with me,
There
my
you
email
go.
is publicly available.
There you go, ladies that are watching. Reach out to Jimmy. Well, the reason I bring that up, though, too, is that at least statistically, we're seeing this growing trend of people not getting married as each successive generation comes along. And I think that from when I'm talking to younger people and I'm reading what they're posting online, it seems for a lot of Catholics, this is an involuntary state of things, right? Like they want to find somebody, but because of their upbringing or just the way that society is organized these days, it's becoming more and more difficult to find somebody. And so I was wondering, like, what advice would you give for people who are in this state of kind of waiting and anticipating and wanting, but finding that, the opportunities aren't there? Like, how can they continue to live their faith well and continue to grow in virtue, and trust in the Lord in those circumstances?
Well, so I guess I'd say a couple things. The first thing is, I think our society needs to be restructured on this point. Because our society has made a terrible mistake, in my view, by adopting romantic love as the motivator for marriage.
Okay.
Because romantic love is a phenomena that comes and goes, and it is not a stable basis for a stable relationship. Also, in the past, romantic love was not what motivated people to get married. It was not the norm. There was an understanding that, okay, you get married, you start building a life together, and love will come, and it'll be there sometimes. You won't always have rosy feelings, but it'll be there sometimes. But it's something that grows out of marriage. It doesn't lead to marriage. And so, like in ancient Israel, okay, you're a boy, you're 16 years old, you're considered an adult, you're of marriageable age, and so your parents find a suitable spouse for you. and you pay what was called the mohar. In English, they often translate it the bride price, but you
Mm.
pay the mohar to the other family, and the two of you get married, and you start a life together.
Mhm.
And it was very transactional. And the function of the parents on both sides was important because they know their kid, they want their kid to be happy, and they have an adult perspective on who would be a suitable candidate, which is something the young person may not have.
Mm.
I mean, they may have a perspective, but not an adult perspective on who's going
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
suitable in the long term.
Mhm.
And so, this was, to my mind, and in today in traditional societies where this kind of model is used, the marriages are more successful than they are in the West.
Mm.
And so I think that this model is the one that humans are best suited to based on how we're designed. And so I think our society needs to be restructured on this point. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So, how do we make do in the meantime? Well, all suffering presents us with an opportunity for growth. And so, to use the old phrase that a lot of people's parents used back in the day, offering up your sufferings,
Mm.
entrusting them to God and saying, I have this suffering. I'm lonely. I wish I had a partner. I don't right now. So please use my suffering for my growth and
Mm.
for the growth of others. And then keep yourself on the market. Keep looking around. Be
Mhm.
creative. Today,
Mhm.
even though, I mean, I grew up pre-internet, and today people have possibilities for making connections on the internet. There are internet matchmaking services.
Mhm.
So there are options, and it's just a matter of working those options. And so if one is lonely, one can find community, in your church or with friends or so forth. But you also want to keep working the options if you're looking for a partner. And in the
Mhm.
meantime, until you find one, offering the situation up to God and trusting Him to bring good out of it.
What do you think changed that has caused us to reorient ourselves to this expectation that there needs to be infatuation and hormones and romantic love present before we can progress to something that is more like a practical commitment and an institution?
Stupidity and marketing.
Okay.
Mhm.
When you say marketing, do you mean like the modern sort of media industry? Is that
Well, yeah, and going back at least to the early 20th century,
okay?
you had books and films and presenting these grand love stories,
Mm.
and it's not wrong to have grand love stories. I mean,
Sure.
romantic love is a powerful human emotion
Yeah.
that has its place in human life, but if you focus exclusively on that, then it's going to set you up for failure.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
candy is a pleasure as well that can have a reasonable place in human life, but if you focus your diet exclusively on candy
Mm.
and you ignore your need for fats and proteins, whereas candy is dominantly carbohydrates,
Yeah.
you're going to mess up your health. You're going to have problems. And in the same way, if you
Mhm.
focus your emotional life exclusively on I need romantic love, you're creating an emotionally unbalanced diet. And that's going to set you up for problems. You're going to think through the lens of romance instead of through the lens of practicality. And is this person a good match? Will we be financially compatible? Will we be emotionally compatible in the long term? Will we be
Mhm.
compatible in terms of our worldviews? And so, but novels about grand romances and movies about grand romances, they don't focus on those things.
Yeah.
And so I think that the media complex, including books and things like that,
Mhm.
has miseducated people
Mhm.
in terms of what they should expect out of a relationship, and it leads them into bad relationships long term.
Yeah.
The more
Yeah.
grounded historical perspective, I think serves people better.
Yeah, it is unfortunate because our culture, the messaging of our culture does seem to impose this idea that if you're not in a relationship, there's something you should be at least envious, if not think of yourself as somewhat, lacking or maybe even defective if you aren't able to find that. And to maybe even exacerbate it through this relentless depiction of romantic love everywhere. Like you can't go shopping in the grocery store without hearing some song about romantic love. Like every pop song is either about sex or
Mhm.
love. Every movie, even like The Hobbit, when they converted The Hobbit into a cinematic story, they couldn't. They had to find a love story in there somehow, and so they brought in. I can't even remember. I didn't even see the whole movie, but there was that elvish character who
Eowyn.
and is that who it was? Okay,
Mhm.
with one of the dwarves, and it's just
Oh,
like
that. Oh, okay, that's a
in
different
The Hobbit.
situation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I was thinking
So
Lord of the Rings.
no, no, no. Well, because that is somewhat in the books originally, right? But they shoehorned this love story into The Hobbit
Mm.
that didn't exist in the books, right? And so it's sort of
Mhm.
like we have to constantly talk about like romantic love, and that's gotta be exhausting for people who are trying to be patient and trying to be content at the same time. But we're just constantly inundated with this message that like, yeah, this is what you want. This is the object of all of your desire. Um, so
Yeah. Well, tune out that message. If it's making you
yeah,
feel bad when you
yeah,
watch a certain kind of show or movie or book, don't watch that movie or show or read that book.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the advice I would give too, is to try and create reasonable, healthy filters on
Mhm.
on pop culture when it relentlessly um, imposes that message on us for sure.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so actually, one more thing I wanted to ask you about was,
Mhm.
in my experience of being married, one of the things that it has really blessed me with, I already talked about parenthood and the ways that it forces you into sort of self-sacrifice, but like accountability is a big thing too, right? And in not allowing us to indulge certain vices or
Mhm.
to reveal certain vices to ourselves, right? Because of the consequences that the way that they might affect us in our relationships. So for people who haven't found themselves in a religious or a priestly or a marriage vocation, like what advice would you give for them to continue growing in virtue and to not let themselves kind of go stagnant without those measures of accountability?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
So,
Because I mean, how to grow in virtue? Well, identify your weaknesses and then try to be less weak in those
yeah.
areas. Trust God. A foundational step is getting educated on what
Mm,
virtue is. What does the faith require? And then pursuing that. And you mentioned accountability. Well,
mm,
okay, once you've formed your conscience, you'll know what a mortal sin would be.
mhm,
And as Catholics, we've got accountability built in of you need to go to confession when you
right.
have committed a mortal sin. You're also free to confess venial sins. Just don't confess them at such length that it prevents other people from being able to confess their mortal sins because you're hogging
Right.
all the time and they're left in line. You,
Hmm.
you can make an appointment with the priest if you want to go in depth.
Yeah.
But uh, then some people find it helpful to have accountability groups that they
Hmm.
meet with. That's not my thing.
Okay.
But if it is your thing, well, okay, use it. Just be discreet about what you reveal in such
Mm,
situations, and make sure you're discreet about anything that is revealed to you.
mm, hmm.
Spiritual direction is kind of a middle step between confession and an accountability group where you may have a
Hmm.
spiritual director you go to periodically. But I think fundamentally what you're trying to do here is build your own internal accountability,
Mm,
your conscience. You're trying
hmm.
to properly form your conscience to tell you when you're being virtuous and when you're not. And
Mm,
that's the ultimate goal, is not going to confession or having a spiritual director or having an accountability group. It's
yeah.
internalizing the accountability so that you don't need external accountability. Now,
Yeah,
it's
I
still
think that's the
there
thing
and
that a
is.
lot of people struggle with, though, right? Like,
Mhm.
is that when you have motives in the form of externals, right? Whether it be relationships or circumstances or obligations and responsibilities, but when you don't have some of those extra motives that might be available through like the circumstance of a vocation, um, what advice do you like? This is a question for me, especially too,
Mhm.
because you have to do both, but like how do you internalize it and how do you like what motives do you grab onto to ensure that you are progressing in the spiritual life or in the life of virtue?
I I can only speak for myself,
Yeah.
but I study moral theology. I have a conscience. I ask myself questions. I probe my motives. I cross-examine myself. I
Okay.
even do this in dreams.
Hmm.
I have dreams where I'm debating a moral theology question with myself.
Okay.
And it's interesting when I then wake up and I can evaluate the argument I was having with myself from a waking perspective.
Mm.
I tend to find I was right
Mm.
that even though I know I'm not fully morally responsible in my dreams, my analysis in the dream tends to stand up to waking scrutiny.
Mm.
Well, okay, that's me, but I'm the only person I can speak for, and so I have taken an interest in these questions. That interest is partially fueled by other people asking me questions. It's also
Yeah.
fueled by curiosity, and it's fueled by how can I be a good person? And what am I
Mm.
doing wrong? What do I need to readjust? What do I need to not do in the future?
Hmm.
And I've learned a bunch of lessons that way. Some of them are lessons of prudence, which also is a virtue.
Yeah.
Like I learned a long time ago, I rarely respond to trolls online.
Mm. Mm.
And if someone is just being a troll, okay, not going to respond to you. Or if I do respond, it's going to be in an unexpected way that will achieve some good.
Hmm.
But it's just a matter of practicing the virtues and thinking about them and thinking about how to practice them better. There's no magical solution here. It's just
No.
study and practice.
Hmm. Well, and that's one of the things that I think a lot of us benefit from. Some of those externals are in education in how we need to grow in virtue,
Mhm.
but without some of them, I think that I like your point that we do have to educate ourselves. We have to study these concepts and even play the role of the external, almost in a sense, and cross examine ourselves
Mhm.
and look at those motives. So yeah, I appreciate that. Um, I wanted
Hum-
to move.
Humans are terrific mind readers in terms of
Mm,
even apart from ESP, we read each other's minds through natural means. We put
sure. Yeah.
ourselves in
Yeah.
each other's perspectives,
Yeah.
and taking other people's perspectives is foundational to growth in virtue because Jesus
Mm,
indicated, so the two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, loving your neighbor as yourself means assuming your neighbor's point of view and
yeah.
saying, what would I want done for me if I was in my
Hmm.
neighbor's position? And that requires you
Hmm.
to read your neighbor's mind in
Hmm.
this naturalistic sense.
Okay.
And so thinking about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and assuming the other person's perspective is foundational to growth in virtue.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to move on to apologetics because this is obviously your great claim to fame is as one of like the great Catholic apologists. Um, how did you and I've often sat back in just admiration at how much almost encyclopedic knowledge you have and um
Mhm.
you watch debates today too, and you'll see people with like their phones out and they're consulting Chat GPT or whatever. But you're from
Mm.
that era in which you just had to know this stuff, right? If you were
Mhm.
in a debate scenario. And so, I guess my first initial question is, how did you acquire so much knowledge? Do you think that that's just a particular aptitude you have, or can just about anybody with a reasonable intelligence go through a curriculum of learning this stuff and being capable of defending the faith the way that you do?
Well, I think that different people have different aptitudes. I think
Okay.
everybody, I mean, everybody who is not literally every person, because some people, are developmental handicapped and may not even
Sure.
be verbal. And
Hmm.
we wouldn't expect a person like that to be able to engage in apologetic discussions. But
Right.
anyone of normal intelligence can develop an aptitude in apologetics where they can use it as a skill to serve the Lord.
Mm.
Um, some individuals are going to have opportunities provided to them to develop higher levels of
Hmm.
apologetic skill. And those opportunities may be in terms of the time they have available, it may be in terms of the skills they have available or the aptitudes they have available, but there will be
Yeah.
a range of different apologetic contributions, but almost everyone can make a contribution.
Mm.
So you don't have to be a professional apologist to do that. In terms of how to do it, well, I think that there are um, a couple of strategies. One is sort of getting groundwork, and knowing the faith is part of that. So,
Mm.
one of the things that I would recommend to anybody who's interested in working in apologetics and defending the faith is learn the faith, read the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
And then you also want, I mean, in its entirety, it's not that long, there's a few hundred pages. And then you want to understand the sources of faith. So read the entire Bible.
Mm.
And beyond the Catechism in the Bible, um, there are other resources that, depending on the kind of apologetics you want to do, you'll also need to read. Like, let's say you're born into a family where you've got relatives who are Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, you're going to need to read about Jehovah's Witnesses in order to be able to serve those people. But someone born into another family that doesn't have Jehovah's Witnesses may not need to read those resources unless they
Mm.
just have an interest in Jehovah's Witnesses. So it becomes more targeted as you figure out what kind of apologetics you want to do. Now, I'm something of a generalist. I kind of
Mm.
want to be a Swiss Army knife of
Yep.
apologetics and have a broad range of skills that I can use in different contexts. And because I've chosen to do apologetics full time, I have had time to develop a lot of those in a way not everybody would have time, but everyone can do
Mm.
something. And I don't know everything. There are specialists who know more than me in
Sure.
given areas. And so part of what I've learned is how do I contact those specialists when I need to learn something particular. But a lot of
Mm.
apologetics, other than the foundational laying level, is reactive,
Okay.
figuring out what the need is and then
Mm.
doing your best to help. Like I was very surprised. Now I come from a background in analytic philosophy. That's what my academic training is in.
Yep.
And so I had a lot of experience, like arguing for the existence of God and doing philosophical arguments in support of the Christian faith. And then when I became Catholic, part of what I did, because I'd been Protestant for a number of years,
Yeah.
when I did that or that review of the categories of systematic theology, that was basically teaching without realizing it. I was teaching myself Catholic apologetics and why I need to be
Right.
Catholic as opposed to a
Yep.
Presbyterian or whatever else I might have
Hmm.
studied.
Hmm.
So I kind of picked that up on a foundational level. But then when I started working in apologetics professionally, all of a sudden the background that I have is not what I'm being asked about all the time. I
Mm.
start getting lots of questions. This was the 1990s, so this was the era of
Yep.
the liturgy wars. And I
Mm.
start getting lots of liturgy questions because liturgy is primetime Catholicism, and people are concerned when
Yeah.
someone's messing with their liturgy. Is this okay? Is that okay?
Yeah.
How do I resolve this situation where there's a conflict? And so I ended up having to become a liturgist.
Mm.
And, just a piece at a time, learning the liturgy. I ended up writing, basically a textbook on the
Mm.
liturgy.
Okay.
And similarly, if you're helping reconcile people with the church, which is part of what apologists do, you're going to hit marriage questions.
Yeah.
I need an annulment, or I'm married to all kinds of practical canon law questions come in.
Right.
So I started. contacting canon lawyers and asking them questions. Eventually got to the point where we could argue canon law matters, and sometimes they would win and sometimes I would win. And so I ended up developing expertises in that. One thing that people can do, there are a lot of apologetics books being published these days. You can read those. Now, a lot of times people ask me, what do you think of this latest apologetic book, whatever it may be? And for me, the answer is typically, I don't know. I haven't read it. Because I already have a basic foundation in apologetics. I don't need to read the latest, beginner book in apologetics. I need to read advanced academic work so that, and at this point in my career, what I'm trying to do is not absorb new data for purposes of recycling old arguments. I want to absorb new data so that I can bring new data into the service of apologetics and expand the field by introducing new data and new arguments. And so I'm not reading the latest apologetic book to come off the press. I'm reading history and science and, all kinds of other fields to try to create a more sophisticated, more comprehensive response on the part of the Catholic faith to various challenges.
I think it was Saint Basil the Great who I forget the name of it, but he's got that text on the formation of young pupils, basically, and sort of that grammar school model where they went through like dialectic and philosophy before they went into theology, and he says that they should read philosophy before theology. Do you think that should be sort of the standard approach, that if you are going to get into talking about church teaching and constructing arguments around how best to persuade people of the truth of the faith, that they should have a proper grounding in philosophy to begin with?
No.
No.
If you want to be a professional, you need a grounding in philosophy. Where you get that, and I got it at the beginning. And that's a fine way to do it, but I wouldn't say it's the only way to do it, because I'm not going to tell people, I think everyone can make a contribution in apologetic discussion. And just like everyone can make a contribution to evangelization. If I told people they need to go study philosophy before they can make a contribution, it's going to cramp their ability to make that contribution, because they're going to get bogged down. I would say, if you got your relative, he's a Jehovah's Witness, learn about Jehovah's Witnesses first. Don't go learn philosophy first. Learn philosophy when you're able, but it's really people who are working professionally that need a background in philosophy, whether that's as an apologist or priest or whatever, because philosophy is also part of priestly formation. But for ordinary people who just want to do what they can in their circumstances, you don't need a big study program. Have a little study program where you learn about this one thing, and then you can respond on that. And if new subjects come up, we'll learn about those things too. At some point, if you decide to go further into the subject and you want to have a broader skill base, then absolutely, take philosophy. I would especially say take logic. There are a lot of things like metaphysics and epistemology that are not as essential for doing apologetics. Logic how to construct an argument and analyze an argument. That's the most important part of philosophy for apologetics.
Yeah. So for people that maybe don't necessarily want to get into like the professional degree of contribution to apologetics, but they do find themselves having these conversations maybe online or with family and friends, like what would be like 2 or 3 really foundational books for them to read, do you think?
I don't, other than the Bible and the Catechism, which
Right,
themselves
other
are
than
more
that,
substantial
yeah.
investment. It depends on the types of apologetics they're wanting to do. There are books that are beginner level that are comprehensive, that are available on different scales. Like I wrote a very short book called The Words of Eternal Life, which is a very short, very informal, very easy to read defense of the Christian faith. And it's written to be able to hand to somebody who's not a Christian and have a positive, you know, hopefully winning exposition of here's why, you know, you should consider the Catholic faith. And that would be also a good read for someone who has no experience in apologetics, but is interested in getting some exposure to the field. But really, what you need to do if you want to do apologetics is ask questions of the person you're trying to help, because
Yeah.
people are not all the same. And I see a lot of apologists making a mistake of making assumptions about the person they're talking to. Like, you know, oh, you're a Protestant, therefore you don't believe in the real presence. So let me unspool all of my real presence arguments that I've taught myself on you.
Right.
And then you
Right.
find out they're a Lutheran or an Anglican or a Methodist, and they do believe in the real presence. So figuring out who you're talking to and who you need to serve is going to tell you how you need to serve them. So asking questions, that's why I mean, there are general books of apologetics that can be of some use. I would actually recommend Catholic Answers established an online school of apologetics where we have various courses. I teach the Intro to Apologetics course. Then we have a sequence of courses: evidence for God, evidence for Christ, evidence for the church, that move you through a kind of what's called classical apologetics methodology to give you a broad exposure. I would recommend those. There also are books coming out in association with that. Like I have a book that's just about to come out. It's supposed to come out in the spring of 2026 called Evidence for Christ, where I assume the existence of God, because that's a separate course. And there are loads of books arguing for the existence of God. But I assume that and then say, okay, now let's look at the evidence for Christ. And let's talk about the Messiah and the different understandings of the Messiah, messianic prophecy, how that's been understood. Let's talk about Jesus, his relationship to history, whether he fulfilled messianic prophecy, whether he was raised from the dead, and so forth, and lay a basis for here's why, you know, you can confidently believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and thus that Christianity is true in general. It's not, I'm not arguing for the Catholic understanding of Christianity, but just for Christianity in general. There's also lots of books written by different people that are useful. Peter Kreeft and Ronald Ticelli's book, Handbook of Catholic Apologetics, is its current title. It's actually not really focused on Catholic apologetics specifically. It's focused on Christian apologetics more generally, but it's a great book. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's a great book. C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, and especially his book, Miracles, and several other books by C.S. Lewis are really good. And, you know, these are some of the books that I guess I would recommend to someone who's interested in getting a basic understanding of apologetics, but mostly apologetics is situational. You're going to mostly learn from individual challenges or questions that individual people have, and asking them questions so you understand their view rather than making assumptions about them is key. And then if you don't know the answer, you do your homework. I've been doing Catholic radio for going on 30 years now. And I mean, I forget exactly what it is, 25 maybe. And I would do my best to help people on the air. Sometimes I would have, you know, I try to have as knowledge that's as comprehensive as possible. Sometimes I'd have to say, I don't know. I'd have to do research on that. Other times I would do my best in the moment to give them a response that was as good as I could make it. And then as soon as I would get off the air, I would go cross-check my answer. And sometimes I would cross-check it with 4 different sources. And so that rigor, I want to do what I can to help someone in the moment, but then that rigorous cross-checking of I'm not gonna just accept something that is easy or convenient for me. I'm going to cross-examine my answer and find out, could I improve it next time? That was a self-educational process that helped
Have you
me
ever had
grow
to
in
do like a
knowledge.
mea culpa on air and
Oh
correct
yeah.
yourself? Or yeah,
Oh
okay,
yeah.
wow,
Yeah.
yeah, okay,
And not being afraid of that is important.
right. Yeah, I mean that's got to be one of the most difficult things is that as you enter into this space, you can become very purpose driven, right? Where it's just always about directing towards the answer and having an answer, but it really does take um, some composure and some humility to be able to admit, yeah, like I don't actually know the answer to this question, and that can be sometimes just as effective as trying
That's
to BS
yeah.
your way through it.
And I don't recommend people BS their way through answers.
Yeah.
I see a lot of apologists, and I don't normally watch other apologists, but I
Mm,
have seen a lot of apologists BSing their way through answers,
okay.
and at least I don't know how obvious it is to most folks, but if
Hmm.
you're an actual apologist and you know the answer they should be giving, it's
Mm,
obvious when they're BSing. And
yeah,
one of
yeah.
the things they tend to do is they start unspooling on other stuff they know that's related to the topic.
Gotcha.
They
Yeah.
don't directly say, the answer to your question is, they start
Mm,
talking about related stuff and circling and hoping they're going to think of what they need to deliver as
mm,
the answer.
mm.
And that initial spiral is a dead giveaway that they're killing time until they can think of the
Come up with
answer.
something interesting to say. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you think in a situation like that, they should just admit it and say, yeah, I
Yeah.
don't really know. Yeah.
And that's easy. I do that
Yeah.
all the time. People sometimes want to hold Stump Jimmy Akin contests, and I tell them that's easy. Just ask me about some totally obscure thing, and I'll
Mm.
say, "Well, I don't know. I'd have to do research on that."
Hmm.
And I admit it right up front. It's no embarrassment,
Mm.
or I say, it's been a while since I've looked at that. I need to check, if I have some
Mm.
knowledge, but I don't feel confident enough in my memory of it. It's like, well,
Hmm.
I'd have to check. I may be able to check on the spot, like if I'm answering a question on the radio. Um, I may be able to use a search tool to
Yeah.
pull up the information that I know I have. I just want
Refresh.
to
Yeah.
confirm it. But other times it's like, well, I'd like to help you, but I'm afraid I'd have to go do research on that.
Hmm. What
So
would
go
you?
ask AI, for example, instead of insisting that I give you the answer.
Well, that's interesting to me because we are living in this age now where people could just as easily go and consult AI, and
Hmm.
as an apologist, I mean you can use AI as well. Have you
Yep.
spent time kind of playing around with AI to see what kind of answers it gives, and what do you
Yeah,
think of this new
it's
era?
it depends on which AI you're using and what it's
Yeah,
trained on. A lot of AI, like if you just go to Google and ask its AI, it's going to get a
yeah,
lot of stuff wrong on technical subjects,
mm,
because it doesn't know which sources are trustworthy, and it tends to summarize what you find on the web. I
right,
always, if I'm using AI for research, I want to see the sources.
yeah,
And some AIs are better about providing you sources. But I never trust anything AI says any more than I would trust what some person says,
okay,
because all AI is a summary of what different people have said. So
right,
I consider it an initial research step rather than a definitive answer.
mm,
Um, and for my own purposes, I want to see the primary sources, or at
hmm,
least scholarly sources that I have confidence in as secondary sources. So I guess there is a role for AI, but if you just want to know, what's the rule for when Christmas technically ends?
mm,
Well, AI can get you in the Catholic Church. AI will
hmm,
get you there, but
hmm,
it's like human opinion. It's not perfect, so you always got to
sure.
cross-examine it.
Yeah. I find like a chat GPT, I mean, will generally give pretty good answers, even about like Catholic theology. But when you start to ask it more nuanced questions,
Hmm.
and especially when you ask it for sources, that's when it starts to just fall off the tracks, I find a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are other AIs that are designed to give you the sources it's based on.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
there are some that are specifically trained on Catholic sources, like
Right.
the AI we have at Catholic.com is
Yeah.
specifically trained on Catholic sources.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. So within your experience, like you said, you've been doing apologetics for a long time. You've been on Catholic radio for coming up to 30 years.
Mhm.
Um, are there certain questions that you hate answering because of the and I don't mean like
Mhm.
obscure ones, but like ones that are generally kind of foundational to people's perception of the faith that are really difficult to answer and um, tend to throw you off balance sometimes if you're trying to be that source of knowledge for people.
Well, there are questions I hate answering, but it's not because they're difficult. It's because people
Okay.
ask them all the stinking time, and I get sick of answering the same thing over and over again. Now,
Yeah.
what those questions, and I've even thought, and this is a joke, but I've
Okay.
thought about writing a book on the most common questions that people ask, and it would be called "I Told You Already,"
Mm,
and then I could have sequels like "Don't Ask Me Again."
right.
And things like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
But the most like and what the most common questions are has changed over time.
Yeah.
Back when we first started Catholic Answers Live, the two questions that were most commonly asked were, "Did Jesus have brothers?"
Mm,
and "Where is purgatory in the Bible?"
okay.
And I had to answer those over and over and over, and I got sick of it.
Mm,
I felt like if anyone asked me, "Did Jesus have brothers?" again, I'm going to scream. And so, but later, the audience started, and the reason that those were the questions were back when Catholic radio was just beginning, no one had heard the answers before.
right.
People were under catechized and they were
Mhm.
under apologeticized, and so they hadn't been able to ask these questions of anybody. So they asked really basic questions,
Right.
and then as the audience learned over the course of a few years, they stopped at asking the simple questions. They
Mm,
started asking more sophisticated, more obscure questions,
mhm.
and so the not quality is not the right word, but the sophistication of the questions
Okay.
rose.
Yeah.
Then Catholic Radio had an expansion onto new stations, which brought new people into the listening community, and that caused some of the basic questions to return, but they were mixed with the more sophisticated questions.
Mm,
And so this is just something that varies over time. Usually, at any given time, there are certain answers I've given recently, repeatedly, it's like, can we give this one a break for a while?
mm,
But I don't have a problem with people asking uh, difficult or obscure questions. If it's obscure, I'll just say, I don't know. I'd have to do research on that. The ones that I have more hesitation on are ones where the answer is so big that it's going to be
yeah.
hard to answer in a radio format.
Yeah.
But I have podcasts now where I can go into more depth.
Mhm.
So I don't have a problem generally with anything other than repetition. Repetition to me is the most annoying because I don't want to just, like I've said, I don't want to just repeat existing apologetic arguments. I
Mm,
want to expand the field. And
right.
that means I also don't like hanging out on, oh, here comes this question again. We're still hanging out back here. I want to
Mm,
be what the questions I find most interesting are
right.
ones that require me to actually think
Mhm.
and not just repeat stock answers. And so I actually enjoy the ones where I have to think and have to formulate an answer.
Mhm. Yeah, I find like whenever I'm publishing videos or sitting down to think like, what's a topic that would be interesting? I'm often trying to push myself out to sort of
Mhm.
those fringes of thought of things that I could use more time contemplating. But it's funny because I see a lot of the same. I'm not in Catholic radio, so I don't have to have those kind of monotonous, repetitive interactions. But I do see a
Mhm.
lot of the same questions in the comments on my videos, right?
Mhm.
And they're these same kind of tired tropes. And so every now and then I'll go back and I'll kind of revisit one. But I initially didn't like the idea of repeating videos that I've done in the past.
Mhm.
But every now and then I would go back to a topic that I had done in the past and maybe come at it from a different angle. And I would get a lot of comments from people saying, "I'm so glad you addressed this topic."
Mhm.
That made me realize that there probably is a lot of value to this repetition, because
Mhm.
sometimes people can't go and find it in the old library. They've just never heard it asked, or they're
Yeah.
just approaching the faith for the first time. So as monotonous or as tedious as it gets, that I think we do have to find that resolve to continue to answer some of those same questions over and over again.
Mhm.
So, are there particular ones that you've considered like the most difficult, though, or are they all kind of equal in,
Mm,
measure?
nothing leaps out to me as more, I mean, a lot of the things where I say I can't answer, it's because it's dependent on specific factual details.
Yeah.
Like, why in the Chaldean rite does the priest wear this liturgical garment this way in this situation?
Mm,
And it's not like if I knew the answer, it wouldn't be hard to articulate, but this is something I've never studied.
mm, right.
I'm in the Latin rite, so my knowledge of the Latin rite is greater than my knowledge of the Chaldean rite.
Sure.
I love the
Sure.
Chaldean rite. I just don't regularly attend it, and so my knowledge of Chaldean liturgy is less than my knowledge of Latin liturgy.
Hmm.
But it's actually the more in terms of that's a matter of factual detail, and those I don't find a problem because I just say I don't know.
Mm,
Um, the ones that are there, the ones that are m- more complex than matters of factual detail, I actually find more interesting,
okay.
because I may have to hold several different elements of the problem together in my head and sort through it, and that actually makes it more intellectually stimulating.
Yeah.
The question, there is a sort of trepidation to one kind of question, and that's one that has pastoral impact.
Mm,
If someone calls and says, "I've got this delicate pastoral
yeah.
situation," well, I'm not a pastor,
No.
and unfortunately, a lot of pastors aren't really pastors either. But
Mm,
like if someone calls up and says, "I've got a moral dilemma,"
hmm.
well, I may be able to help them with the moral dilemma. I can help them think through, the relevant principles. But
Right.
there's a limit to what I can do because a lot of times their moral dilemma involves people, and
Yeah.
they know the people, I don't. And
Hmm.
all I have is this person's. I'm glad that they're asking. I'm happy to do what I can, but I only have their perspective on this person. I don't
Yeah.
know what the other person would say. And I
Right.
don't know, is the other person, I don't know anything about the other person other than what I'm being told, and that may not be entirely accurate. And
Hmm.
so I have to, at some point, say, well, you know the people better than I do. You're in more of a position to judge, what strategy is going to be best here. Especially questions that I have hesitancy about are ones that involve uh, major things like life or death decisions.
Mm,
Like do we discontinue medical care here, or
right.
employment decisions, like do I need to quit my job?
Yeah.
And for
Yeah.
those, I'll do my best to help people in the moment, but then give them a referral
Yeah. Yeah.
and say the people who are the real experts. Now, here's what I would say, but the people who are the real experts in this are, let's say, the National Catholic Bioethics Center. So here's their website. Go to their website, use the contact thing to request a consultation before you make a final decision.
Hmm.
So I've given you some perspective, but do not simply rely on my perspective
Yeah.
before you do or don't pull the plug or before you do or don't quit your job. Go get more than one opinion from qualified professionals. And so those are ones, when there are important personal stakes like life and death or employment or things like that or divorce. Um, I those are ones where I get less comfortable
Hmm.
because I don't want people simply acting on my perspective.
Hmm.
I'll do my best to give them a good perspective, but they need more than just what I would say.
Hmm. When you were originally training, or you had this idea that you might go into academia, or maybe
Mhm.
even like the role of a pastor, and I don't know much about the kind of training that they get as pastors, but one of the big challenges,
Depends
whether it's
wildly on which group of Protestants you're talking about.
fair enough, but one of the one of the common problems I can anticipate is this notion of, or the reality of just being a high profile person in the community, right? And some of the honor and even fame syndrome that can come along with that. And this is a big thing now in social media, right? Because we have like the phenomenon of the influencer
Mhm.
and the celebrity factor that comes along with that. Now you have a lot of experience going all the way back to the radio days, or the merely radio days, so that you already had some experience of this.
Mhm.
Did you guys get extra supports or trainings on how to deal with being so high profile in the role that you play, and remaining humble and steadfast in your faith within that?
No,
Okay.
I'm self-taught.
Okay.
Um, I had analytic philosophy as academic training, but everything subsequent to that has been self-taught. I've
Yeah.
used a tutor occasionally, like for learning Greek and Latin. I used a tutor, and recently I've learned parapsychology um, through formal instruction,
Mm.
but basically I'm an autodidact, and so I
Yeah.
study multiple different things, and I'm largely self-guided in my learning. One of the things that has been very important to me um, is not getting too big for my britches, you know.
Hmm.
And there are a variety of ways that I do that. One of them is I look at people who I think are not striking the right balance. Like
Okay.
there is a particular politician, and I won't name this politician. I won't even say who they're affiliated with. But
Sure.
this politician was known for saying to people, like, don't you know who I am?
Mm.
And to me, that's the most crass, uncouth thing I could imagine saying. Now,
Yeah.
part of it, I probably have an advantage here in that I'm from the South. And the South is an honor based culture where
Mm.
you don't have to say things explicitly. There are communication compared to other parts of the country, like let's say New York, in the South is very subtle.
Mm.
And so you don't just listen to what the person says, you listen for the implications of what the person says.
Mm.
And so that upbringing, and that's part of one of the things about honor cultures is they tend to have politeness culture as well, because
Hmm.
if you dishonor someone, it can lead to a fight. And so honor cultures tend to be very polite to minimize fights.
Yeah.
And as I read in one book once, people in the South will be excruciatingly polite until they are ready to kill you, because they're going to be very polite to minimize conflict, but when it's time for conflict, look out.
Mm.
And so I grew up with a politeness culture, and part of politeness culture is you don't be a jerk to other people. You don't get too big for your britches. And so
Hmm.
I have internalized as part of my own internal review, making sure that I'm being loving and kind to others.
Mm.
I take Jesus's command to love everybody very seriously. And that doesn't mean you always like the other person because they may be
Right.
being a jerk.
Hmm.
And I don't have to like the fact they're a jerk, but I want to be a genuinely loving person to everybody, and that means recognizing my own limits, and that's why, like
Hmm.
on the radio, I try to acknowledge rather than BS, I'd rather just say, yeah, I have to study that.
Hmm.
That's an admission
Hmm.
I don't know. And there are other things that I do that so looking at how other people are handling themselves, and do I think that this is the right balance or not? I use
Mm.
that as a cross check. Also, in terms of offering stuff up, there are things I have reason to be humble about. I'll give you an
Okay.
example. Recently, I did a podcast about a set of statements, a couple of videos by Father, oh, and I'm blanking on his name now. He's a young Franciscan priest on the
Father
East
Casey.
Coast. Father Casey, yeah.
Hmm.
And he had made a couple of videos saying that it is not appropriate for
Right.
people to go and say a prayer to thank God after they've received communion. That he was
Hmm.
maintaining that people need to, according to the law, they need to be singing
Right.
when they return from communion. And this upset a bunch of people, and I knew it was going to upset a bunch of people. And it's also, frankly, not what the law says.
Hmm.
And so I did a video where I read the law and explained what the law says. And in his case, I put in a little extra snark. Now I wasn't
Okay.
rude, but I
Yeah.
put in a little extra snark because he should know better.
Mm.
And one thing that does get my goat is when I see people restricting the liberty of others,
Mm.
because I feel very passionately about I do not want to impose my views on others. And other
Especially as
people,
church law.
yeah, and other
Yeah.
people should not impose their views on others who
Yeah.
are their innocence in this situation. They're not experts in church law. And here comes this guy telling them to resist their pious instincts, which is to say,
Hmm.
thank you. No, you got to sing this song. And
Hmm.
that's going to put people in situations of conflicts of conscience. You
Yeah.
know, I want to say thank you, but he's telling me I got to sing. So which one do I do? And I feel bad
Yeah.
either way. If I say thanks to God for communion after communion, then I feel bad because I'm not doing what I should by singing this hymn. On the other hand, if I sing the hymn, I feel like I'm not doing what I should by thanking God. And so
Yeah.
people like Father Casey who misrepresent what the law says cause suffering by trying to restrict the liberty that other people have to by insisting they conform to their own opinion. So I'll be a little snarky when I'm
Mm.
dealing with a person like that. Just a little, not too bad. But and I try never to be rude, but not flat out rude. But at the beginning of this video, I had a misunderstanding of something. Now, I was
Mm.
absolutely right about the law, but in terms of introducing who Father Casey was to the audience, because I can't assume everybody knows who he is. I know
Yeah.
a little bit about him, but I'm not a follower of his, so I don't know a ton about him. But I did know that he had a channel, and I had always misread the name of his channel. The name of his channel is actually Breaking in the Habit.
Yeah.
There's that preposition in there. But
Yeah.
because of the popularity of the phrase in a non religious context, breaking the habit, which people would
Oh,
apply
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
to smoking or,
Sure.
diet or exercise or whatever, that
Takes on a subversive tone
yeah,
almost.
and you put
Yeah.
it in a religious context, it sounds subversive.
Yeah.
Well, I had, because of my history with that phrase, which I've been hearing all my life, because it was a big phrase in the 60s and 70s,
Mm.
especially the 70s. I had always misunderstood the name of his channel. And
Mm.
so when I made my video and I introduced him, I said he has this channel called Breaking the Habit. And I'm not sure why he would want to, um, name his channel after breaking something in a religious
Hmm.
context. I mean, I
Well, and
get
that's
that it's,
common enough among certain religious communities that they really are trying to shed that dimension of their religious vocation, the habit.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I didn't even want to go into it in that level. I just wanted to note that this is not a good sign,
Mm.
and that's all I did. And then I moved on to talk
Yeah.
about the substance of the issue. Well, so I post the video, and then it turns out the name of his channel is Breaking in the Habit, like breaking in a
Mm.
pair of shoes. And
Right.
it originally started about his journey into the monastic life. Well, this puts a completely different
Mm.
complexion on the name of his channel. And so I realized I'm going to get a bunch of people correcting me in the com box. They're going to say, no,
Okay.
no, 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 this is the name of his channel. Now, I could have taken the video down, redone it, and put it up
Hmm.
without that. but I said, well, I made a mistake here. This will be good for me to grow in humility. So I left it
Mm.
up, knowing I would have loads of people correcting me on this.
Right.
I even went into the com box and acknowledged and said, yes, I've discovered this. What I could have done was even added and note the risk that Father Cole would take by giving his channel this name. A lot of people are going to misunderstand it.
Mm.
And I had commenters saying, yeah, I've always misunderstood the name of his channel as Breaking the Habit. I always thought that was,
Yep.
shady.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I went in to the com box, and especially in the early days, and acknowledged, yep, I got this wrong. But I've allowed it to stay up, and people continue to go into the com box and say, actually, it's breaking in the habit. And every time I see it, it's an opportunity for me to remember Jimmy Akin can make mistakes and should acknowledge them and accept the fact that he can make mistakes and just be humble about it. So practical moments of taking lessons in humility and not trying to hide them and not trying to, deny them is part of maintaining humility for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Did you have any contact with Father Casey after that, or did he acknowledge that or reply to you at all?
He did.
Okay.
He sent me an email, and I don't think it would be appropriate for me to go too much
Sure.
into that
Fair
email and
enough.
what was said. But
Fair enough. Yeah.
he did reach out and make contact.
Okay. Yeah. Father Casey is interesting to me because there's definitely areas where he strikes me as having a different perspective than me.
Yeah.
And that, when all you have is just the information, that can feel like, well, is there malice behind that? Is there goodwill behind that? Is it an honest mistake a lot of the time? But I have found, like, I've had some interactions with him, and I have found that he does seem quite sincere in his
Mhm.
faith, and just a different stream of formation, and therefore a different perspective. And not that it's valid necessarily, just that
Yeah.
he's
This
got a
was
different approach.
this was something else that was an aspect of that I thought was interesting. In my
Mm.
video in introducing him, I mentioned that he's young.
Yeah.
He's like in his mid 30s, and
Hmm.
you have to be in your mid 20s before you can even be ordained a priest. And he was ordained after that, so he has only been a priest for, I think, 6 years at this point, something like that.
Could be. Yeah, I forget
And
now. Yeah.
people took this. Some people took this in the comments as me looking down on him because he's young,
Mm.
and that was absolutely not what I was doing. I
Mm.
was giving him a way out.
Sure.
Because if he was as old as I was, him being ignorant on this point would be much less excusable than
Mm.
he's young, he's new, I'm trying to save face for him
Hmm.
by mentioning his age.
Hmm.
Because it would just be a lot less excusable if he were older. So I'm trying to be kind and generous here, but it got taken as, oh, you're running down young people. No, I'm not. But,
Mm.
that's just an illustration of how um, people coming at a situation are bringing their own perspective with them, and that can affect how they view it. What some people perceived as dissing young people, I was viewing as an act of kindness.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that makes sense. When you started in apologetics,
I was
there was
young.
almost
I made mistakes. I still
right,
make
right,
mistakes.
right. But there was also like there was certain measures of quality control
Hmm.
on who could do it and who couldn't. Right. I mean, not unless you really were sophisticated technologically, you couldn't just start broadcasting on the radio, right? You had to get a job with an outfit like Catholic Answers or something like that, and they would vet you and make sure that you were competent in what you do. But now
Hmm.
we live in this age in which a person like me can get some cameras and flick them on and publish on YouTube, and if I can generate enough interest in what I'm doing, and there's good ways and bad ways to do that,
Hmm.
I can become known as an apologist, or at least a prominent voice in the church.
Hmm.
What do you think of this age of influencers? Do you think it's a net positive, or do you have concerns about it?
Well, I think I would say both.
Yeah.
There are, on the one hand, I'm fundamentally in favor of greater communication among
Yeah.
humans, and I'm not a big fan of gatekeepers in any field.
Mm.
Um, on the other hand, that means that freedom of communication, which is, kind of a correlate of freedom of speech, which I'm in favor of,
Mm.
is also correlated with Sturgeon's law, which is was a principle named by the science fiction writer Theodore Sturgeon, and
Okay.
he had a narrow application of it. He said, because people were pointing out the low quality of science fiction
Mm.
literature, or a lot of science fiction literature at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, yeah, 90% of science fiction is crap, but
Mm.
then 90% of everything is crap. And that's true. And you take away the gatekeepers, you're going to have more garbage on the market.
Mm.
But in a marketplace of ideas, the guiding principle is that truth should ultimately win out unless you impose new constraints that impede the proper development of the market and the shape of the debate.
Mm.
So there's a messy phase you're going to go through in trying to get to a truthful consensus, but it's, in my view, it's better to have the messy phase than to try to shut down discussion out the gate and just tell people what to think.
Mm.
This is the reason the Borg keep losing on Star Trek. They have one perspective on everything. They are the
Yeah.
definition of groupthink.
Mm.
And one of the principles of battle is a battle plan never survives first contact with the enemy. As soon as
Mm.
things start happening, you're going to have to adjust and change your battle plan, and that means you need different perspectives and debate. Someone ultimately has to make a decision, but you need that competition of voices to force out the truth.
Mm.
Just like competition benefits people in the marketplace, so there's not a lazy monopoly that can get away with high-priced inferior products. Competition improves the products and drives down the prices in the marketplace. Competition does the same thing in the marketplace of ideas. It improves the quality of the ideas that are there, but it means you're going to have to go through that initial period of creative destruction. And so I am not so risk averse that
Mm.
I would rather avoid the period of creative destruction. I'd rather see the competition of ideas to expose what the truth is.
Mm.
And so that's the good that I see in modern communications, with the internet and so forth.
Yeah.
What I have concerns about are influencers who are not actors in good faith.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of influencers who are rage baiting people for
Mm-hmm.
clicks,
Sure.
and that is not healthy. There are some influencers in the Catholic sphere who I could name, but will not for the moment, who feed their audiences on a constant diet of looking down on other people
Mm.
and anger.
Yeah.
And neither of those are a good long term emotional, intellectual diet. They are
Mm-hmm.
both looking down on other people constantly and being angry at other people constantly are both violations of the second great commandment, love thy neighbor. And
Mm.
you're making it harder to love your neighbor if you're never doing anything but looking down on your neighbor and being mad at your neighbor. And yet it gets clicks. And so there are Catholic influencers who are rageaholics on their
Yeah.
channel, or
Mm-hmm.
condescensionaholics on their channel. And I think that's a detriment, that,
Yeah.
allowing free speech in an internet context, you have to be willing to tolerate that, but it's still bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell people, I don't think any channel that operates in that way is one that you should be looking to.
Mm.
They're going to distort the truth so they can get the condescension and anger that they want, and that's not what you should be feeding your spiritual diet with. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be able to look at other people with love and compassion, even if you disagree with them, and you need to not be constantly angry. There are some uh, there are some individuals that I've seen, and these aren't all Catholic, uh,
Mm.
but they're in the religious sphere, but they're not
Yeah.
all Catholic. And I want to go to them and say, do you ever enjoy anything? I mean, when was the last time you made a video that wasn't looking down on other
Mm,
people? Where
mhm,
can't you ever make a video where, hey, I read this thing in the Bible and I thought it was so great. It's such a great insight. Let me explain it to you,
mhm,
or here's
mhm,
this other thing that I was thinking about and I had this insight or I learned this thing and it's just so cool. I want to share it. And that's what I try to do
mm,
dominantly in my own communications. And not just my religious ones, but Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World too, where I look at mysteries as like, let's have the joy
mm.
of discovery here.
Right.
And I do respond to people, and the most I ever get is a little snarky. When I think someone deserves a special pushback, but I want to keep positive, and I want to have a diet of discovery and joy and love and only occasional correction or critique.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I wish more influencers would do that. Also, I think there is a very great risk of governments and corporations distorting the marketplace of ideas, like
Mm,
saying you cannot discuss this or we will
mhm,
not let our algorithm promote this. And so I am very suspicious of overt and covert censorship in the marketplace of ideas.
mm. Do
So
you think that like the risk of like the cult of personality that is certainly present in Catholic media, and you can see some people maybe leaning into that a little bit is worth the risk, especially when lay people don't have the same formation to be leading voices in the church that say someone with a priestly vocation does, right? Like
mhm,
ideally their seminary formation, they would give them some formation around being a prominent person, being someone who is
mm,
standing in the spotlight a lot of the time. But lay
mhm,
people don't have a lot of that spiritual formation, and so like one thing that really gets me is that risk of scandal, especially
mhm,
moral scandal and moral
mhm.
failure. When that happens, like, do you think that that's worth the risk in the marketplace of ideas, or that there is some things that we maybe as a church or even just in the community of apologetics could do to try to mitigate those problems?
Well, I think okay. So, is it worth the risk? I would say ultimately yes.
Mm,
Now, part of that may be because I'm an American and freedom of speech is a value that has historically been so valued by Americans. It's actually in our First
mm,
Amendment to our Constitution.
yeah.
Um, on the other hand, I think that the church today is on board with that, and encourages a discussion and dialogue from people of all different groups.
Mm,
Now, it acknowledges that there are trade secrets and things that privacy matters, things people need to be discreet about.
mm,
But I think the church is fundamentally okay with freedom of speech,
mm,
and isn't really into censoring views. Now, it teaches certain things. It'll say, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. But
mhm,
if it's not saying, oh, and we shouldn't allow Jews or to deny that.
mm,
It'll allow Jews should have freedom of speech for their views. Now, if there can be consequences for things, like if you're teaching heresy to Catholics, the church is going to warn about that, and you're going to get excommunicated and things like that. But that the church is not saying today we need to execute this guy so he can't express his views.
mhm,
So there's a difference between consequences of a monitory nature, meaning of a warning nature,
mhm,
and and uh, and censorship.
mm.
Um, in any event, we could go into this in more. There are several layers to this. We could go into them,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
fundamentally, I think that it's worth it to allow people of different opinions to express their views I think that is a process that needs to be managed and shouldn't be uncontrolled, because as part of a marketplace of ideas, you need people providing alternative perspectives. So if a Jehovah's Witness wants to go out and say Jesus Christ is just an angel, not the Son of God, well, then, in the sense that Trinitarians understand it, well, then that Jehovah's Witness needs to get pushback in the marketplace of ideas. So that's how the marketplace works: is you let competition between different ideas serve to help unearth the truth. This is why we also have an adversarial justice system, where we let lawyers make arguments for both cases.
Right.
And it's understood that allowing those arguments to be tested by the other party will help us get to the truth better than just letting one side talk.
Yeah.
Whichever side it is. And in the same way with trying to figure out truths of other nature besides who committed this crime, or is it even a crime? But, like, what does this Bible verse mean? If you let scholars debate it and discuss it, and you don't have to be scholars, but if you let people debate it and discuss it, that's more likely to get you to the truth than just letting one side talk.
Yeah, something like that goes back all the way to the Middle Ages and before in certain forms. But I'm thinking of, like, St. Thomas Aquinas was famous for hosting, like, the disputations, which was a big thing in the university system then, where people would come up and they would have this opportunity to discuss things that were controversial and sort of hash it out in that environment of intellectual exploration.
And those were much broader than just Thomas Aquinas. Loads of universities had disputations that the scholars at that university would participate in.
Yeah, for sure. So you think that, because I guess in that system, it would have been somewhat controlled and enclosed within a particular context, but you think the broadening of that context has been a net positive for society?
Well, how are you going to evangelize people who aren't Christian if you don't let them talk? I wouldn't be very effective as an apologist if all I ever did was give my arguments and never interact with anybody else's point of view.
Right.
So I think dialogue and discussion is part of how we advance the cause of the gospel. And if you because we're not the Borg, you can't just seize control of someone's belief system with implants. You have to persuade, and persuading people means respecting them and taking their viewpoint seriously and giving them answers to arguments and concerns they have.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Okay, so I'd say we're running out the clock here, but maybe one last question I wanted to ask you about was just the state of the church today. Obviously, the work that you're doing, you're participating in the mission of the church and laboring in the harvest of the church, so to speak. And I have some experience of this where you're trying to achieve certain ends with apologetics work or with commentary or rhetoric, and then sometimes the church seems to almost be shifting and swaying, and sometimes that can feel like it's interfering with some of those ends, depending on what's going on in sort of the public conversation. And so I wanted to ask you, like, what do you think should be the church's main priority right now, just based on where we find ourselves at this state of history? And do you think the church is doing a good job of addressing that?
Well, it's a good thing I'm not Pope, because I would be terrified, because I don't know, just to my own limitations, I don't claim to know what the church should do in terms of the current historical situation. There are some questions that I'm just not an expert on, and that is one of them. I know that the church should share the faith. It should provide pastoral care for people. It should dialogue with non-Catholics and encourage them in the ways it can to, at a minimum, have peaceful relations with others, and if possible, move them closer to the Catholic faith and hopefully become part of the Catholic faith eventually. So there are a variety of things the church needs to do. I have questions about some things that have been done. Like, I would have a question, and this can be misunderstood, but I think that some churchmen today put a greater priority on financial charity than on evangelization.
Mm.
And I think both evangelization and financial charity have a place in the Christian life.
Yeah,
There are provisions for caring for widows and things like that in the New Testament.
of course.
But evangelization has the higher priority from the New Testament, and
Mm.
so I think when churchmen place more emphasis on social programs
Mhm.
than on teaching and preaching the faith, I think there is a mistake that's being made there. On the
Mm.
other hand, financial charity can serve the cause of evangelization, and so
Mhm.
that's something that needs to be remembered and incorporated into the picture. But I don't have the wisdom
Mm.
to sort out and say what's the thing the church needs to focus on today. I'm sure the church, I mean, there's 7 billion people in the world.
Mm.
And so there's a ton of different needs in the world. And I don't have the
Yeah.
wisdom to be able to say what's the most important one. I would say there are certain principles, multiple principles that the church needs to pursue that are not in competition with each other, and Christians need to do their best to promote all of them.
Mm.
If the Pope asked me for assistance on, like if he wanted my opinion on various matters, I could share that with him. Like one of the things that I think several recent pontificates have done too much is, although it got better in the Benedict reign,
Mm.
but is intruding too far into the political realm and the economic realm.
Mm.
That because those are fundamentally the territory where the laity needs to find the solutions. The church should stick to principles,
Right.
and not try to propose solutions.
Mhm.
And so I would say that various documents from recent pontificates have unduly intruded into solution territories
Mm.
where the church does not have the kind of divine guidance it would need to find
Mhm.
solutions.
Yeah.
And there are a bunch of areas like that. And I understand the reason why. I mean, historically, people would look to their bishop, to, hey, we've got a problem here in our diocese with
Yeah.
the merchants or the king or whoever, and they'd look to their bishop for help. And
Yeah.
it's natural when you have a platform to want to use that platform for good.
Mhm.
And this is again just part of my own principles. I've taught myself to shut up on things that are not my territory. Like
Mm.
you'll notice I never talk politics. I
Mm.
may occasionally talk principles, but I never, and I have political views like anybody does, but I
Sure.
never talk about them in public because if I came out and said I'm a Democrat, I would lose all the Republicans in my audience. Or if I came out and said I'm a Republican,
Mm.
I would lose all the Democrats in my audience.
Mhm.
And so I have experience being the kind of person who needs to remain neutral in order to be of greater service to others. And I
Mhm.
think that this is an area where churchmen could improve their performance. I think
Mm.
they need to stay out of proposing solutions, whether they're political or economic or environmental, and stick with here are the
Yeah.
principles. You laity
Right.
need to find ways to implement these.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was it Pius the 11th who wrote Quadragesimo Anno, in which he says that like there is a difference between those principles and the techniques of applying these principles in the prudential
Mhm.
judgments, and that he says that from the magisterium that we do have a role in addressing principles of economics and of labor and all these kinds of social justice questions, but just not in the technical application of it. And that's where you do get particular policies, whether they're environmental or economic or financial or whatever.
Mhm.
And like you say, that is where the laity and the people actually serving those functions need to come up with the particular
Yeah.
application of those principles.
Yeah, and the experts in them, because one of the things, if you're a churchman, you're probably not an expert in
Right.
economics or politics or the environment. Your
Yeah.
training is in another area. You need to leave this to the people who are under the principle of subsidiarity. You need to leave
Yeah.
it to the people who are most in touch with the subject.
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's great. I love that. So that can punctuate the conversation, but thank you again, Jimmy.
Okay.
It was a real pleasure talking to you today.
My pleasure. Happy to come back on in the future if you like.
Great. Yeah, I'd love that. Okay, thanks for watching that. I hope that that was a blessing to you, that it encouraged you and edified you in your journey with the Lord. And if it did, and if you want to support the work that we're doing as a result, which thank you so much for considering that, because we really do need your help to make this viable. Then there's a few ways you can do that. You can go to brianholdsworth.ca/help, which is obviously my website. And there's some options there. One is to just contribute through my website. The other would be to join us over on Locals, where you can interact with me and other like-minded people. You can gain access to exclusive content, where we're doing live streams and I'm uploading videos and things like that. But we're also doing a secret philosophy study with a secret philosopher academic who's joining us once a month to take us through difficult texts that we want to read on our own, but we need some clarification and some guidance on that. So right now we're working through some works by St. Thomas Aquinas with him, and he's a Thomistic philosopher. So if that's interesting to you, join me on brianholdsworth.locals.com. And again, you can check out my website at brianholdsworth.ca/help.